Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Dave. As mentioned, I'm Ray Pennings, the co-founder and executive vice president of Cardis. For those who might not know us yet, Cardis is a public policy think tank headquartered in Hamilton, Ontario. And in addition to our Hamilton office, we are soon opening another nice new office right over on Rideau Street, just a very short walk from here. So for those of you who are Ottawa-based, sometime in a month or two when our office opens, come take that short walk, come to know us, drop by for a coffee, and get to learn a little more about us. What makes Cardis tick is our concern for the social architecture of Canada and our desire to see it strengthened and supported. While our think tank does not support any political party, we do embrace the little platoons of Edmund Burke, platoons that champion a society where a diversity of robust institutions like families, banks, schools, hospitals, unions, and places of worship are encouraged to thrive without losing their identity to the larger forces of either the government or the market. Cardis, however, is not just a Canadian think tank. We also speak into the context south of the border, and it's in that context that we have come to know Michael Gerson. As Michael is going to discuss, it's an interesting time for conservatism in general in the United States and for the Grand Old Party in particular. We'll see what November holds soon enough, but instead of simply waiting and watching, I'm happy to welcome and introduce one of the top political commentators in the United States who we've invited to help us make sense of what's happening in the United States today and what this might mean for Canadians in the coming years. For those of you who are familiar with Mr. Gerson, you will know him probably through his national syndicated columns and political punditry in the Washington Post. Mr. Gerson's columns appear twice weekly and are syndicated in hundreds of newspapers across North America, including plenty of Canadian newspapers that do reprint his columns. Mr. Gerson is the author of several books, including Heroic Conservatism in 2007 and City of Man in 2010. In addition to his writing and speaking, Mr. Gerson is also a senior advisor for One, a bipartisan organization that works to solve problems of extreme poverty and preventable disease. He serves on the board of the Initiative for Global Leadership Development Council and the U.S. Center for Global Leadership. Prior to all of this work, Michael Gerson was a top aide to President George W. Bush. He worked as the chief speechwriter and assistant for policy and strategic planning, and was a central figure in advocating the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, the Malaria Initiative, and the fight against the global sex trafficking. I think all of this is enough to say that Mr. Gerson comes to us with a rare insider vantage point with which to look at the state of conservative thought in America today and some lessons that we can learn as Canadians. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in giving a Canadian welcome to Michael Gerson.
That's much appreciated. My thanks to the Manning Center, to Ray and to Cardis, and to the Hill Family Lecture Series for this opportunity. I'm honored by your invitation, and I'm grateful for the chance to visit Ted Cruz's home and native land. Last night's debate was pretty good for Cruz, very good for Marco Rubio, excellent for anyone who likes to see bullies get bloodied. But it has been a strange election season in America. This will be remembered as the Twilight Zone year in which Donald Trump is the Republican frontrunner and got into a two-way global insult war with the Pope. Let me back up and think about this from 30,000 feet. These two men, one, a world leader who connects to deep longings and sets the terms of our cultural discussion, whose very words are spoken ex cathedra and followed by legions of the faithful. The other man is the Bishop of Rome. My intention this afternoon is to talk about the most extraordinary development of my political lifetime, a rising populism, which could massively change conservatism in America and possibly break the Republican Party as an institution. But let me tell you just a little about myself. A few of you might have vaguely recognized me, or at least my glasses. The most common thing I hear in airports after I've made an appearance on Meet the Press or the PBS NewsHour, "Oh, you're the guy who is not David Brooks." I started off as a theology student at a Christian school named Wheaton College outside Chicago. It is, as some of you might know, a pretty religiously conservative place. The joke on campus when I went there was that the administration had banned premarital sex because it might lead to dancing. I was a policy staffer on Capitol Hill, a low-level speechwriter during the 1996 presidential campaign. Took a detour into journalism, and then in the spring of 1999, when I was a senior editor at U.S. News & World Report, I got a call from then Governor George W. Bush of Texas, who wanted to meet me at a D.C. hotel. The first thing he said was, "This isn't an interview. I've read your stuff. I want you to write my announcement speech, my convention speech, and my inaugural address, and I want you to move to Austin immediately." At that point, he was not even a declared candidate, but his confidence was infectious, and so I loaded up my family and went. From the start, we were a little bit of an odd couple. He is outgoing, athletic, likable, and I'm actually none of those things. He has a penchant for locker room humor that makes me uncomfortable. I remember after one policy session at the governor's mansion in Austin, everyone had gone but me, and the governor had some time before his next appointment. He asked me, "Do you want to hang out a little while?" With a rudeness that now seems crazed, I replied, "Not really," which is not the way to treat a future president. But I came to respect Bush as a politician and as a person. He's casual and funny and authentic and kind and loyal to the people around him, and he can occasionally be sharp-tongued. Every year on the day of the State of the Union address, the president sits down with all the network anchors for a time of question and answer. At one of those sessions, the late Peter Jennings, Canada's own, asked him, "What does it feel like to go before the nation and read someone else's words?" The president immediately replied, "You do it every night." The pace of those years was at times exhausting. It has a cost to your health. In December of 2004, while working on the president's second inaugural address, I had a heart attack. The president's doctor had me checked into the hospital under an assumed name to hide from all the press calls. Adding insult to incapacity, there wasn't a single call. And it has a cost to your family. During the heat of the 2004 presidential campaign, my little boy Nicholas, who was then 6, announced to me in the car that he wanted John Kerry for president. When I asked him why, he said, "So you can be home on weekends." When I asked him, my 9-year-old, who was a little more practical, then said, "But how would we eat?" I told him I think I could get a job, I might go to a think tank. And he said, "Of course, what is a think tank?" And so I told him, well, it is people who read and speak and have meetings and things. And Bucky, and this is true, said, "You mean they don't do anything?" Sorry about that. After the 2004 election, my job at the White House changed. I became a policy advisor to the president, focused on global health and development and conflict issues, areas where my interests had been leading me for many years. And I saw something hopeful. In one of the bitterest times of partisanship in modern history, I saw a number of issues where members of both parties and people of every ideology could come together. I worked with conservative and liberal groups to fight global AIDS and to confront malaria and to oppose global sex trafficking. While working on the global AIDS issue at the White House, I got to know Bono of U2 a little bit. He invited me to the first rock concert I had ever attended, and it was loud. Soon afterwards, my wife and I had dinner with Bono, who is a very idealistic and principled man. After that dinner, my wife told me, "You may be idealistic and principled, but it would also be nice if you were rich and cool." As the head of speechwriting, I had an office in the West Wing. Back then, there was a TV show by the same name in which Rob Lowe, who some consider a handsome guy, played the character who held my job. We even met a few times. I remember my wife telling me with great disappointment and regret in her voice, any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. I have also met Angelina Jolie. My wife was there too, I think. Or so she tells me. Now, I'm a columnist at the Post, living under the tyranny of 2 deadlines a week. I'm a fellow at the One Campaign, an international grassroots organization founded by Bono and dedicated to the fight against extreme poverty and preventable disease. I could hardly speak to you at a more confusing time for an American political commentator. I've been so wrong for so long about the political appeal of Donald Trump that I am tempted to sit down now, content that at least a few of these jokes succeeded. But I will press ahead. I know from a lot of political experience that a political party is an ideological coalition. It forces you to work with people who almost drive you crazy. Even though I shared a party, for example, with Newt Gingrich, I was never a fan of his approach and style. In 1996, I remember then-Speaker Gingrich had a 16% approval rating in the polls. At one event, he turned to Bob Dole and asked, "Bob, why is it that people take such an instant dislike to me?" Dole replied, "Newt, because it saves them time." At least that's the way Dole tells it, who I worked for during his presidential run. He also has a famously sharp tongue. I remember him saying that Al Gore was so stiff, his Secret Service code name was Al Gore. This moment, I think, is different. In America, we're seeing something in another category entirely, the attempted hostile takeover of a great political party by a pernicious force. The American media, deeply codependent with the Trump phenomenon, focuses on the horse race aspect of this campaign. But there is one great story on the Republican side of this election, the return of ethno-nationalism to the center stage of American politics. Many of my Republican, even Democratic friends just can't believe that Donald Trump can possibly mean what he says. They think, as Mark Twain said of Wagner's music, that it is not as bad as it sounds. It must be somehow part of the show. But the assumption of hidden rationality is baseless. Trump has shown a remarkable consistency in this campaign. He said he would build a wall across a continent and compel Mexico to pay for it, that he will conduct the forced expulsion of 11 million undocumented workers, which would require an immense new apparatus of enforcement and internment camps, that he would ban the immigration of Muslims to America and send Syrian refugees back into a war zone. This is not, as many liberals in the United States try to argue, the natural outworking of conservatism. It is the corruption of conservatism. It is not the inevitable outcome of populism. It is the use of populism as a poison. This approach is closest to the type of right-wing, anti-immigrant populism that we are seeing rising across Europe, in Hungary, Denmark, Sweden, Poland, Greece, the UK, and France. In today's Washington Post, I call attention to the foreign policy implications of Trump's versions of American nationalism. It's not an easy thing to discern a foreign policy in the collected tweets of Donald Trump, but he generally views Japan, South Korea, and our European allies as freeloaders who should defend themselves or pay their own way. He believes Mexico is a scheming enemy. He proposes a destabilizing trade war with China. He believes that Vladimir Putin should be given a free hand in the Middle East, surrendering a leading U.S. role in the region. And he proposes fighting the war on terrorism by purposely targeting the families of terrorists on the theory that toughness is demonstrated through war crimes. I won't dwell on this topic. Suffice it to say that Trump would be a president who cannot reliably tell the difference between America's enemies and its friends. You know that the world sometimes complains about American moralism, about American lecturing. Wait until they see the immense power of America unconstrained by the great ideals of America. On foreign policy, Trumpism is Putinism by another name. And the world does not need more than one Putin, if that. But let me focus a bit on the domestic and economic policies that I think where there are some lessons that apply across the speaking world from economic populism. Some things like nativism and protectionism can't be incorporated into a center-right party without bringing it to ruin. But conservatism is also about necessary adaptation, and the economic populism of our time has lessons to teach. For those who criticize populist candidates, it is doubly important to understand and address the causes of populist discontent. A way of life in which increased productivity resulted in higher wages and a realistic shot at economic advancement is fragile in some places. For many people, work is now a series of part-time, temporary, and contract jobs. The old promotion pathways are more rare. Life can have instability, worry, and toxic stress at its core. The political divide emerges with how this challenge is explained. Some argue that the old economic certainties were stolen. It may have been bankers and speculators at fault, or it may be Mexican immigrants and the Chinese, but larceny is involved. As economic analysis, this is wrong or partial, but it is the political consequences that concern me. If our economic opportunity has been stolen, the purpose of politics is not to solve this problem or that. It is to fight and defeat enemies. Practiced by Trump or Jeremy Corbyn, this is a politics characterized by anger, retribution, and enmity. This has the chemical advantage of lighting up the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain. If I remember my Psych 101 correctly, this portion of the brain includes the hypothalamus, which regulates the 4 Fs: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and mating. There are many problems here, but the worst is misdiagnosis because it undermines the possibility of productive change. The old economic certainties have not been stolen. They have been undermined by a vast economic transition that has placed workers in competition with talented workers around the world. This has resulted in a consistent downward pressure on wages and a ruthless demand for higher skills. And this has happened at the same time that family structures, humanizing community institutions, and important social norms have weakened. In the context of economic populism, conservatives who are identified with the status quo are likely to be run over. Conservatives who are a pale version of liberalism will be unnecessary. More is needed than a critique of Keynesianism. Conservatives need a governing vision applying conservative and free market ideas to the task of giving people the skills and human capitals to succeed in a modern economy, a conservatism of the common good. Several years ago, the American writer Michael Kinsley held a contest for the world's most boring newspaper headline. The winner, as you probably know, was Worthwhile Canadian Initiative. I am an advocate for the Worthwhile Canadian Initiative, and we have them in America too, gathered in a movement that has been called Reform Conservatism. There should be, there can be, distinctly conservative proposals that improve skills, increase the rewards of work, and encourage economic mobility. Proposals to reform immigration in productive ways, make entitlements more modern and sustainable, shape a growth-oriented tax system. There can be conservative approaches to maternal and child and newborn health, and market-oriented methods to address the threat of climate disruption. A distinctly conservative vision of the common good will encourage the decentralization, the strength of family and community, and the importance of religious education and religious liberty, the health of civil society, where human beings gain the values that make a life of success and meaning possible. Others can offer anger and envy. Conservatives should be known for common purpose and respect and civic pride and voluntary associations and personal responsibility and a generous, inclusive spirit. These are not just the foundations of a free economy, they are the substance of a democratic way of life. And I'll conclude by saying that conservatives should also be known for a passionate moral commitment to human dignity. This is one great role of religion in a democracy, as one root, one basis for personalism, the belief that everyone matters, that everyone counts, that no insignificant person was ever born. In every way that matters to God, human beings are completely equal and completely loved. They matter more than any cause. They are the cause. Those who question the association of conservatism with this ideal haven't been paying attention for the last 300 years or so. There was Wilberforce's fight for the abolition of the British slave trade, and Burke defending the rights of Catholics, prosecuting abuses of power in India, and defending the rights of Americans, and Lincoln emancipating American slaves, and Lord Shaftesbury caring for the victims of the Industrial Revolution, and Churchill's deep concern for European Jews. And yes, I am biased, but I would include the leadership of George W. Bush, who helped save so many lives from AIDS and malaria in Africa. During the 20th century, in government offices in Berlin, Moscow, and Beijing, decisions were made to take the lives of millions. I got to sit in the Oval Office and watch President Bush make decisions that saved the lives of millions through PEPFAR and the President's Malaria Initiative and other initiatives. That is a broad bipartisan achievement across two administrations, but it began with a fully conservative belief in the priority of the person. I suspect during the next 2 weeks of this campaign, a lot of Republicans are preparing to identify with Dick Tuck. Tuck lost a California state Senate election in 1966. In his concession speech, he took the stage and said, "The people have spoken, the bastards." It is at moments like this that conservatives turn to history for consolation. It is the great power of historical texts, in my view, that they speak to us differently in different times. We read certain speeches and documents again and again, but then in a new context, in a new light, they speak across the years as close as a voice over your shoulder. Last night, I looked at George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation at Newport, Rhode Island. President Washington made a trip to Rhode Island in 1790 after it finally ratified the Constitution. Moses Sexius, the warden of the local Jewish congregation, was on the reception committee and read a letter thanking Washington for his service. Rhode Island had the new country's largest Jewish community for a reason, because other states were not the best places to be Jewish or Quaker or Baptist or Catholic. 4 days later, Washington responded, "The citizens of the United States of America," he wrote, "have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it were by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." And Washington concluded, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while every one shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." This is the proper conservative response to anger and division, a belief in inherent rights held equally by all the children of Abraham and everyone else. And when my country comes back to itself, as it always does, there shall be none to make them afraid. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. What we're hoping in the time that's left is to have a bit of a conversation of how we take some of the lessons of American conservatism and apply them to the challenge that we face here in Canada at this time. As I listened to your speech, I drew two conclusions. I don't think you like Donald Trump. And Secondly, you were advocating a sort of conservatism of the common good, reform conservatism, all of that's gathered in there. Underneath all of that comes, you had what I thought was a beautiful quote, the belief that everyone matters and that no insignificant person was ever born. There's a sense of our concern for our neighbor in that. I don't think conservatism in Canada is necessarily branded as being the party, the movement that has the concern for the other at its heart. It tends to be very much about economic advancement measured by GDP, growth, economic growth. Are there any lessons in terms of how do we go about changing that brand? Is that communications? Does it start with just the substance of the policy? Are there things that we need to learn to avoid as we think about how do we go about changing the brand of conservatism in this particular climate?
I think it's more than brand, and it is a philosophic recognition that economic liberty is absolutely essential in the effective production and distribution of goods and services, and it is the most effective and efficient way to do so. And by the way, it has produced extraordinary results over the last 25 years of world history, taking 1 billion people out of poverty, one of the great humanitarian achievements of history. But it has to, economic liberty has to be achieved and is only achieved in the context of healthy social institutions that have a vision of the good beyond getting and keeping. So there's an essential connection, I think, between economic freedom and the institutions that prepare us for the exercise of economic freedom, that prepare us, that give us the values and virtues and skills and belief in education and ourselves and responsibility in order to make capitalism work properly. And so, so I guess I would argue that a kind of mature conservative appeal can't just be GDP, can't just be economic liberty. It has to be rooted in something. And that is rooted in the health of civil society. And that is the realm of ideals. People stay together in families because they're convinced they should stay together in families, because they believe it is good and true. And that, I think, is part of the conservative message as well. And I'd go even further than that, of course, and as I argued in the speech, that part of that message as well is not just utilitarianism. It's actually a belief, a distinctive contribution is a belief in human rights, universal human rights and dignity in every soul, in every heart. And so all of those things together strike me as a mature conservatism, but also one that you would want to tell your neighbor.
So we talk about those institutions and all the civil society institutions, which is music to somebody from Cardis's ear. Our mission is the renewal of social architecture, where we talk about the contribution of those particular institutions. Same time, I'm wondering, to segue to sort of the Trump phenomenon, where it's at. For many years, conservatives, and that's been especially true in Canada, where we've had an ever-burgeoning state, government taking up more and more of that space. We've been sort of talking against government in terms of government shouldn't do this, government shouldn't do that. And so there's been, understandably and necessarily, an anti-government message. I'm wondering, is part of what Donald Trump's appeal there is that message has resonated home? Does that, when we go against the abuses and excesses of the state without affirming the proper use and necessity of the state, is Donald Trump what the reward we reap?
Well, I've been making an argument, a series of arguments in the Washington Post that disputes that premise. I think that might justly be applied to Ted Cruz's candidacy for president. That is clearly a result of Tea Party ideology, a sort of constitution. It's called, in America, a lot of advocates call it a constitutionalism, which is a pretty narrow reading of the Constitution that says whatever is not specifically mandated is actually unconstitutional, including much of the modern state. That is an statement. It's not consistent, actually, with much of our constitutional history. So you can make those arguments, and I think Cruz represents that trend. But I just see something very different in Donald Trump. This is a person who introduced himself to America by saying that undocumented workers are disproportionately rapists and criminals, which is, by the way, not true. But it was a deeply prejudiced statement. And then, where there was no demand in America whatsoever for a complete ban on Muslim immigration, that was not even in polls in America. And Donald Trump raised this, and by the time he finished in South Carolina, you had 8 of 10 Republicans voting in South Carolina supporting a total ban on Muslim immigration. I sat in the West Wing. I know how you fight the war on terror. You do not fight the war on terror by alienating Muslims around the world. It's insane. These are just appeals to nativism. That was the kind of foundation, the basis for this structure. I don't find anything in conservatism to justify that. In my view of conservatism, that came out of Bill Buckley, that came out of, my heroes like George Will, who also writes for the Post. This is a humane vision of human flourishing, not a divisive, nativist vision of exclusion. And so I think it's really important to say that this is not a species of conservatism. It is not the result of conservatism. It is the perversion of conservatism.
You mentioned in your biography, and you shared a bit of that, your relationship with both George Bush and Bono. Being a friend of Bush and Bono put you probably in a fairly limited...
More than you'd think, but yeah.
It's a limited subgroup along the way. I think there's a couple of things. One of that, you've talked about civility, working across the aisle, bipartisanship in terms of some of that. Can you expand a little bit on that in terms of the approach, also in terms of the appeal, contrasting sort of the nativism that you just described in terms of Trump, to how do we go about building those bridges to people whose worldview is fundamentally at odds with some of the things that are being appealed to? How is that transition made?
Well, I think the issues you mentioned are a pretty good example. This is a case where by 2003, we were getting reports back from Africa of absolute horror, of countries that were living in the shadow of death. When I first went to South Africa as a White House staffer and would go to shantytowns, you would see grandparents and their grandchildren, an entire intervening generation gone, people in their 30s and 40s because of this pandemic. It was a horrible human situation, and a threat to the ideal of human dignity. Bush felt that very deeply. He was the biggest advocate of this. But when he raised that banner in the 2003 State of the Union address, the response was pretty remarkable. The biggest supporter in the House of Representatives, who eventually went down to the well of the House to speak in favor of the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, was Nancy Pelosi. And the biggest Republican supporter in the House was Henry Hyde, the main pro-life leader in the House of Representatives. Bush, we worked very, very closely with John Kerry and Joe Biden on these issues in the United States Senate. There just aren't many that fall into that category, but it has been a refuge, a safe harbor from the deep polarization of American politics. And that has been by calling attention to a great American ideal, a great human ideal, rooted in the faith of millions of Americans. So I think it's possible to do that when you argue, when you approach things from a slightly new or different perspective, when you do things that are unexpected. You know, it would be unexpected right now for Republicans in America to strongly identify with the concerns of working class people in practical ways, instead of appealing to blue-collar populism in irresponsible ways. And I think, by the way, it's going to be necessary to do that to compete with the latter.
To segue from there to domestic economics, since I'm a think tanker, I have nothing else to do but you know, read and attend a few meetings now and then.
Right.
So I have read some of your stuff and some of the stuff of reformed conservatism, and you spend a lot of time in the policy prescriptions focusing on working class and sort of the current inequality debate and attempting to reframe that as more of a mobility debate, and given that sense of opportunity, which, you know, I think this audience understands the conservative, or can recognize the conservative roots of some of that. I'm wondering, at the same time, in terms of the public discussion, that's one that certainly hasn't taken much root here in Canada along the inequality.
It hasn't in the U.S. either, to be honest.
So how,
right.
Let's think through out loud perhaps a little bit in terms of overcoming some of that, because one of the areas that Cardis has worked on is building meaning in work and the sense of vocation, and trying to build an economy that's not just about paychecks and dollars, but looking at what we actually do, and the economy is flowing from that. Wondering whether or not you have any insights from the work you've been doing in reform conservatism there on that particular thing.
I think diagnosis matters a great deal on this issue, and I've been very influenced by Robert Putnam at Harvard University. He wrote a great book that everyone should read called Our Kids. American-centric, I think would have a broader application. But he makes the case that this crisis of mobility that we are seeing in some communities is actually rooted in three big things. One of them is the decline, for those big economic reasons that I was talking about, the decline of the blue-collar economy. The second one is the atomization of communities, which used to provide assistant parents, but now are really decimated. And the third one is the decline of the family structure in working class settings, which a lot of liberals in America are afraid to address, but is a reality of life. All those things relate to one another in rather complex ways. And I think it's important for conservatives to recognize that all of them are true. And you know, to bring messages, to bring a message in that context. So the question is, can you shape policies that give people the skills and human capital to succeed in a modern economy? Okay. And that is not just a laissez-faire approach. Okay. This is a large economic transition that is producing large economic and social and moral transition that is producing people who have a tough time competing in a modern economy. And there has to be an active but limited role of government in giving people the skills and human capital they need to succeed. And that, I think, is where the promise is. I mean, there are a lot of proposals out there. But so we do need an economic context that is growth-oriented. You know, I mentioned tax reform, which America desperately needs, and I'm all for that. But then we have to be more aggressive in the task of preparing people for participation in a modern economy, when about a third of Americans, if you look at these numbers, do not have the skills and social capital to compete effectively in a modern economy. That is a human tragedy, and it's an economic disaster.
So it's a mix of a limited government working with civil society players, not necessarily you know, any one by themselves, but the mix of that. In your writings as well, and you address that in an American setting, which is very different. You talk about the institutions that were built in the 50s and the 60s that were designed to do some of this stuff as being horribly out of date with modern reality. Right. Often when we talk about institutions, we sort of end up almost being perceived as protecting things that are out of touch and with the current times, not being modern and forward-looking. How do you hold on to the foundations of what those core institutions were meant to be, at the same time recognize that they look very different today?
You know, it's difficult. I remember one moment, important moment, from the last presidential campaign, when Michelle Bachmann, who kind of occupied the Ted Cruz space, the Tea Party space, the last time around, a kind of populist space, when Paul Ryan came out with his budget that reformed Medicare. Okay? It was a courageous thing that Paul did. This was the first time that the Republican House had done this, and it set, you know, it was politically risky, set out some principles of reform that I think are going to have to be pursued. So Paul Ryan, in a very practical way, wanted to reform the institution of Medicare, make it more market-oriented and responsive. And Michelle Bachmann came out and opposed it. And I think, if I remember correctly, Ron Paul came out and opposed it. And so sometimes I think these reform conservatives that sometimes get a bad rap in America are bolder in a certain way, because they actually want to take seriously the reform of institutions, which is a risky proposition. I mean, it is bold by, you know, definition to do fundamental tax reform, to do fundamental, you know, we have an immigration system. You know, I'm very pro-immigration, but we have an immigration system that was created in 1965 with a series of you know, components that were fit for a different country. And we have some institutions like Social Security that have been essentially, you know, only had marginal reform since the 1930s, and then another, you know, others like Medicare and Medicaid that have not been seriously reformed since the 1960s. And so I think the reform conservatives, if you read, you know, National Affairs magazine and listen to really smart people like Yuval Levin and others in the reform conservative movement, what they are proposing in substance is much bolder than the populists. So, you know, I think there's a lot of hope there. But, you know, I think you're right, however, that the Republican Party as it's currently constituted is not known for this. It's actually known for other things.
We've just got time for one more question. Let's segue in terms of looking forward over the course of the next months. Most people in this room are political junkies. We're looking forward to Super Tuesday. We're watching the regular debates along the way. Could you just sort of crystal ball a little bit for us in terms of what to expect, not so much from a punditry and who wins perspective, but what are some of the lessons that you're looking, that we as Canadians watching it as outsiders, so to speak, might learn from watching this race along the way?
Well, I'll give you the short, dirty version here. The big question is whether a mainstream Republican alternative will be able to make the case that the primary process is not determinative on to Super Tuesday. Because the way that the geography of the primary elections move forward, Donald Trump is going to do very well until then. The hope for Republicans like me is that on the day after Super Tuesday, that the momentum will not be so great and the delegate lead will not be so great, and the sense of inevitability or so great, that would prevent the emergence of Marco Rubio or a candidate like him in the primaries like Missouri and Illinois and you know, the coast. It's an entirely different terrain. So that's what people are hoping. John Kasich makes that harder in this environment. But if you looked at last night's debate, and people should look at it, there were only two real candidates on that stage. There was Donald Trump and there was Marco Rubio. And Rubio did the best job I have seen of prosecuting the case against Trumpism. And that's, I think, what needs to be done.
Michael Gerson, on behalf of those in the audience, we thank you very much for coming to Canada and sharing your insights with us. On behalf of Cardis as well, we'd also like to acknowledge the Hill family for supporting the lecture series, which makes events like this possible, as well as the Manning Center for our partnership. Thank you very much.